All right, so in this section, we're going to take a look at some animation techniques for doing build sequences. So I have a couple of examples here that I'm going to bring up to start out with. So we've got a few different shots. Here's one example. Kill the sound on that. So stuff like this, where you've got different elements kind of folding in and combining, and then also a shot like this, where you've got a bunch of different techniques of just different parts of the building coming together. And then we've got this example as well. I went through and did a bunch of small example scenes because a lot of these actual files are pretty slow to work with. But a lot of the examples I did are based off this film right here. Kill the sound on this as well. So things like boards kind of coming in like this, different pieces scaling out. Pieces folding out like this, kind of the curtain walls coming on in different ways, pieces folding out. For things like the slabs kind of sliding on like that around corners. So we're going to go through a bunch of those techniques, and then Matt will go through some more interior kind of techniques, and he'll talk about some of the rendering process as well. So I'm going to jump over into Max here. The first example that I've got is based off that boardwalk shot in the movie that we just took a look at, with the boards kind of sliding on like this. And there's a few different ways you could go about something like this. It's kind of hard to see up there on the screen, but if we take a look at one of these boards, they actually do have kind of some modeling done for like where the screws would go and stuff like that. So right off the bat, that kind of immediately eliminates the possibility of doing something like just scaling these on, because what's going to happen then is the whole model is going to stretch. And not only that, but you're going to introduce stretching in the texture, the material as well, which you don't really want to have. You want it to kind of just slide on. So for this first one, if I take a look at these, they've all got a simple modifier stack. So we've got kind of the modeling for the actual board down here, and then up above that, we've got a slice modifier and a cap holes modifier. And really that's all it is for these. It's just a single animated slice, and the cap hole is creating that end piece. And then what we've done is we've offset the timing across the board on these. So what I'll do is I'll just select all of these and delete that, and we'll go through how we can add that animation back in. So a little bit later for one of the examples, we'll take a look at writing a quick script to offset some of the timings for repeated tasks like this. But for this example, I want to just take a look at the simplest way, which is going through it manually. So if we break that down, I'll jump back to our movie that we've got here. We've got essentially two different types of motion happening in that shot. We've got the boards that are sliding on this way and the boards that are sliding on this way, and they're just kind of overlapping a little bit. So what I like to do is look for repeated elements like that and do any sort of animation all at the same time, and then offset the animation rather than go through one at a time and repeat those tasks. Anywhere I can kind of bundle them together all in one shot and then just slip keyframes makes it a lot easier. So I'm just going to select every other board in here. And we've already got the cap holes left over, so I'm going to delete that as well. And come in here and I'll drop a slice modifier. on top of this stack. And what I'm going to do is open up the sub-object for this, or slice plane, and just rotate this up 90 degrees here. And we'll check out some of these settings. So depending on your mesh, a lot of times you'll get kind of some awkward geometry happening with this slice plane. This is actually modifying the topology. It's not just hiding part of it, it's creating new verts based off where this plane falls. So usually I find the safest bet to work on faces. It's how all these meshes are calculated under the hood anyway. So this tends to give a little bit of a cleaner result overall. You'll get like weird edges kind of flying out into space. So I'm going to switch that first, and then I'm going to change this from refine mesh to remove top here. So now if I jump into my move tool and start to move this around, you can see that it's slicing those away, but if we zoom up on part of this here, you can see like we've got those details modeled in there. They're staying exactly where they are. It's just cutting away the mesh. The same is going to go for any UVs or materials. They're going to stay exactly the way they are. They're not going to be stretched or anything like that. So you can just move this all the way out front here. And you can actually use the align tool on this slice plane as well. So you can come in here and choose any piece of your geometry and go from the slice plane to either the maximum or the minimum. In this case, it would be the minimum in X, and that'll align you perfectly. So it's kind of a good way to get this set up. And then a lot of times for an action like this, where I have an object that's going to be disappearing, whether it be through a slice plane or scaling down, a lot of times I'll animate it backwards and then reverse it after the fact. So I'm going to come down here and turn on auto key. And we'll just slide this all the way to that side so these meshes are no longer visible at all. And you can play this back and see, start to get an idea of what kind of timing we want here. Again, for this, I'm working in film because that's going to be our final output. You do want to make sure you set that before you start animating because that will offset your timing. So I think a speed of about 10 frames, like a little under half a second, is good for something like this because we have so many and they're going to be offset. So then what I'm going to do is select those keyframes, and if you right-click here in your timeline and come into Configure, you can show selection range, and that gives you this bar down here that allows you to easily manipulate your keyframes. So I can grab one end over here, reverse that to -100%, and now we're getting that action happening there. And I'll jump out of that sub-object, and we'll go through for these other boards here and do the exact same, just in the opposite direction. So again, I'll remove that cap holes. I'll add my slice on here. We'll rotate that 90 degrees. This time we'll move it over to this edge. Remove the top. We'll work on faces. And we'll come down to 10 keyframes, turn on auto key, and reveal those. And then you can reverse that motion as well. Oops. So I think I've got the wrong part chosen here. There we go. So I think I rotated it the opposite direction this time. So rather than remove top, I just want to choose remove bottom. So now they're both revealing in the same motion. So the one thing you will notice when we come to one of these middle frames here is this does leave your mesh open. So that's why we had those cap hole modifiers on there. So I'm just going to select the rest of these here. And we'll throw cap holes modifier onto the top of the stacks. And that'll just close that up. Usually with something like this, the motion is happening fast enough where just having the geometry there is enough. Usually you don't have to alter the UVs on it. Just having something is fine. So we've got all those set up. You can go through select all these again, and what we need to do is kind of think about an overall timing and how we want this to progress through this motion. So we don't want them to happen all at the same time, so we kind of want to play to the camera shot that we're working with. So in this case, we're kind of panning along. So we want some sort of motion that follows with what we already have and kind of doing some sort of reveal of our new geometry in that same kind of fashion. So in this case, we want to come from starting from this side and kind of build on. So in general, what I'll do is I'll find keyframe at about where I want to start having things build on. And then in this case, I'll come up with an offset that I like. So maybe like 2 or 3 frames. And what I'll do is just deselect one at a time and kind of slip these frames over. And you do have to make sure that your objects are not instanced because it's modifier based. If you have instancing happening on these, you're not going to get that offset. So we've got that guy coming on first. So we can deselect.
If they were references, could you get that offset?
If they're references, if it's above the reference line, then yes, you can. A lot of times at this state, I don't bother setting up references because by the time you're animating, you should have final geometry, hopefully. Just double check. I think it's just giving me the instance on that slice modifier rather than the object here. So I'll grab those, I'll de-instance those slices. Do you want to make them unique to each other? I'll say yes. And I'll grab the other side as well and do the same thing.
So the rest of the stack stays instanced,
Yeah.
but the slice plane becomes unique.
Yeah, the object itself can remain an instance. It's just that particular modifier is what we want to get the instance off of. All right, so start down at one end here, do an offset of 2 keyframes, and just kind of work my way through, shifting these over in that particular order. And for something like this, for this shot, I would just animate the pieces that are going to be seen in this view. It's something we'll talk to a little bit more with some of these other pieces, but you really just want to animate the parts that you're going to see. You don't necessarily have to animate, a mile of boardwalk if your shot is going to pan 10 feet. So that's something that you want to keep in mind as you're doing something like this. Kind of plan your camera shots out first, and then go through and animate those parts. So for this case, because we're doing such a small section, it's fine to do, just kind of run down the line and hand offset these keys. A little bit later, we'll take a look at some other techniques through scripting that can kind of automate some of that process as well. But for this case, it won't take all that long. And then there's our result there, so we can play this back. And we have those kind of drawing on right there. So again, fairly simple animation. Really all we did was 2 keyframes, but our end result ends up being a lot more interesting than that. If we come back here, it's the exact same kind of features that are happening there. Question? Or?
Well, we're discussing, so maybe you can share, the technique is great, right? But we're wondering what's the,
philosophy behind the build-up, right? I mean, it looks cool, right? But everything that we have been discussing the last 3 days is about the story that you want to tell, and everything has a purpose and things like that, right? So when things start to move in a way, beyond natural physics, right? There has to be a reason for that, and I wonder if you can share anything about it.
So I will say that, clients still want cool build animations, but when we did this film, it seemed like every client wanted a cool build animation, and by cool meaning not necessarily, physically accurate. So some of that, it's a give and take. Some of it is pushed back. We don't want to do the same thing every time, but if a client sees something else, like I want them to come in like that, ultimately, you can't talk them down, then you might be doing that. So in this case, we knew that it was a new development, a new site, so they wanted to build it up from the ground, right? So in this case, it's not how it physically would be constructed, but it was more just for visual interest. We do have some builds that are a little more how they would happen in the real world, which I'm able to bring up in a little bit. Or I'm wondering if one of the Autodesk builds, like from Dandelion. See if on marketing films by project. So it does depend. You don't want to just put a build in there for the sake of putting a build, but a lot of times when it is a new building or a new project, they want to show it animating on to show the before and after. So, it is kind of on us to kind of reinvent it and not do the same thing every time. So it's certainly a challenge, and we're always trying to get inspired by new things. Like I said, this film I think we did 5 or 6 years ago now. So we've kind of tried to reinvent ourselves since then. But I'll admit it wasn't tied to some carefully thought out story. It was more just to look visually interesting and
a lot of
excitement.
A lot of it was like choreographed with the guy walking along here and trying to follow in that same kind of motion. So things like that.
Sorry, I have a question. Yes, I think that scenes like these are great when they. I remember, I don't know exactly when it was that that these type of animations started happening, and the first time it was very impressive, and it can tell the story about building a new site. But as you say, the downside and what usually happens is that it becomes very impressive. A lot of clients want to have the same animation, and then once you start seeing it over and over, it becomes cliche. The part of the challenges that we have whenever we approach a new animation is how can we take these elements that are magical, the magical transformations and probably allegories to something tied to the story, but that can also cultivate the audience. And a couple of years ago, we started experimenting with different techniques, with particle systems and with all type of systems. The downside is that there's a lot of experimentation, a lot of trial and error, and that is very time consuming. And once you have mastered the technique, it becomes cliche.
Right.
So, okay, yeah, that's not really a question. I'm just like grounding.
No, I'm with you.
I guess the question is what's your perception on that? How do you not fall on the same cliches, not fall on the same type of animations, keep on experimenting, but at the same time make it consistent within the time frame, so that at the end of the day, we're still in business?
Sure. No, that's great points, and I think a lot of us probably are thinking similar things. I think with any creative field, you're always trying to think of the next thing or reinvent yourself. So I think it's just however you do it, just staying motivated and looking at what else is out there for inspiration, and just, you know, constantly just trying to think of new ideas. Obviously easier said than done at times, but I don't know, it certainly is a challenge, but it's also kind of seeing when the opportunity is there. I'm sure a lot of people are under tight deadlines and don't have a ton of time for that R&D and experimentation, but when it does present itself, you kind of owe it to yourself to take that time to try things out. Or even if you don't have the time, to still take the time and try things out. Because if you don't, you're right, things are going to be the same and be cliched. So I don't know, it's not an easy thing to do, but as artists, you kind of need to take it upon yourself at times. I mean, you can show a couple other examples. Just I can continue that thought, but I just wanted to show this real quick. We did this more recently, but this was another film we did for Autodesk, showing off their kind of infrastructure and city planning side of things. So this is just a quick build animation. I mean, there's a lot of the same techniques, and again, to your original point, it's not like real world or the way physics would actually happen, but you know, this was probably a couple years ago now when, you know, seeing a lot of like the time lapse and the kind of tilt shift effects. So we, you know, set up this kind of time lapse camera feel with a little shake and a little exposure change, and having things kind of popping on and off. You know, if you break it down piece by piece, you're right, it's not physically accurate, but you know, it's kind of blending some of the techniques that we already know how to do with just some other ideas. So it's not totally reinventing it, but it's just adding little pieces here and there. You know, a lot of times the budget or the time frame won't allow for total experimentation. So if you can do small things to just augment it a little bit, something you already know how to do. But at the end of the day, it's also not terrible to do something that you've already done and kind of move on, like kind of choose your battles, and don't feel like you have to come up with the greatest idea for every project. It's kind of choosing those opportunities to reinvent.
I think to that point, one thing that we like to do a lot of times is, you know, even if we're reusing some of the same techniques, we look for a single element that we can kind of break out from that from. So in this film, it was kind of these pieces right here drawing on, and then having like a cloth simulation to them as they fell into place. That's something you don't tend to see in a lot of these actions. So they kind of draw on, and then they fall, and they've got some sway to them. So just picking out like one or two little elements like that differentiate from that can also help a lot.
One question: when you render those sequences with animated things, do you use brute force? Do you use?
Matt's gonna talk about that in his section. He's got a whole bit on the render settings that we've.
Okay.
Yeah, but we do usually do it in two passes with the static backplate, or at least with, you know, just the camera move and the static elements, and then the animated elements would be some combination of brute force rendering and other techniques, but we can go into more detail in a little bit.
So jumping back into this scene here, we'll hide that boardwalk and we'll switch to another element here. So for this one, we've got some of those pieces folding on, a few kind of falling into space, and a couple other types of action here. So we'll take a look at some ways that we can set up some of these and how we can reuse some of this animation also. So let's just jump to the end of this here and make a quick copy of some of these sections. I'm just going to offset these up to here and remove all this animation. So One of the important parts of this section, especially when you're working on the exterior of a building, is kind of working with the model that you've got and how you break it apart and where the pivot points are for your objects. So, a lot of Revit models, for example, will come in with these little block pieces like this, whereas, some other softwares, they might be all one element. So it's kind of up to you to assess at the beginning of the shot what kind of actions you're looking for and whether or not the model provides enough flexibility for that, or if you need to go in and break it apart. A lot of times we'll use things like slice modifiers. We'll actually take a look at that in the next kind of case study, to just break apart pre-existing models into these smaller pieces, and then going through and aligning these pivot points. In this case, we're getting a folding action that's happening. So we need to make sure that the pivots on these guys is in the right place on the bottom, so that as they go through and fold, we get the correct motion here and they're not flying away from the surface that they're starting on. So again, with these, we can go through and actually I've set them all up in a way that so these were created as copies. So if we look at the local rotation of these guys, you can see that they're all rotating the correct way. So if you're lucky enough to be building your own model for part of this, you're able to set that up. Sometimes if you're getting a model from a client, you won't have that. So an easy way to get that is to just make selections of all the objects that are facing the same way, go into Effect Pivot Only, and rotate those to have the correct offset, because that will save you a lot of time, reusing animation. So like I said, I like to, whenever possible, do one animation and then just offset the keys on it. So this will be another example of that. So I'll come on here and turn on Auto Key and rotate these guys. We'll do a full 180 degrees here for that folding action. And then we're also going to do some scaling for these. So one thing that I found when you scale animated elements, sometimes if you scale them all the way down to 0, it can cause problems in V-Ray where buckets will just hang on them forever. But if you go to like 0.001, for example, it's still small enough that it's not going to actually show in the render, but you won't get any of those issues at all. So we'll get those keys down, we'll reverse them, and we can scrub that motion and see. So they are building on properly. One thing that I did for the other example, though, was I did some non-uniform scaling to these guys to get them up to their full length sooner, rather than kind of uniformly scaling out in both directions. Yeah.
When you are rendering this kind of animated objects in V-Ray, what kind of radiance map settings that do you use? Single frame, from file, multi-frame incremental, or? When
we render exterior build sequences, we don't use irradiance maps. We use brute force and light cache. So for these guys, a couple frames in here, probably like 2 or 3. What I'm going to do is scale these all the way out so that they're already their full length, and I'll make sure I do that in local space as well, so that it's matching on all sides. And so we get kind of a nicer folding action there happening. And then from there, let's take a look at, for this example, some ways that we can offset this with some scripting. So I'm just going to pull up our script editor here, our listener. And a lot of times when I'm doing build sequences, I'll just write these kind of really simple one-line pieces of script, just snippets that are specific to that animation. We have some more advanced tools that we use here that are pretty customizable, but a lot of times, it's so specific to that one task that I'll just do a one-off. So we'll do a quick for loop, and it'll just run through all the objects in our selection. So for I in 1 to selection.count, do. And again, this will be another one that will give you a copy of this script so that you can try it out on your own. We'll do move keys, selection I, and we'll do the transform of it. And then we'll do, for the amount that we want to move the keyframes, we'll do a number, and then we'll multiply it by the number of the selection that that object is. So we'll do, I don't know, 5 times I. And I'll just take one of these objects and test this and make sure it works. And it looks like it's working fine. You can see when I run that, it just shifts the keys over by 5. So what will happen is every single object that we have selected, so that's the first object, keys are going to be shifted by 5. On our second object, they're going to be shifted by 10 because we're multiplying that, and down the line. So what we can do is we can switch our selection type from rectangle to the spray can. I use a lot for this technique, and we'll just go kind of in order here. Select these very quickly, and then run that script. And you can see what happens now is they kind of build on in order, right? So we can just kind of cruise around to all the different sections here, and it makes it a little more visual. It's not this huge complicated script that's trying to do everything all at once. It's got some user input as well. So that's why I like to do these little one-offs like this. So really quickly now, from one animation, we've got kind of some cool timing going here. And this script is, this little snippet here is totally reusable, and it's good for any type of animation you do as long as it's transform related. So this could be a position, this could be a scale, this could be a rotation, and it could be any number of objects. So if you just have like a little arsenal of little snippets like this that you can jump to, that works out really well. So do the same in back here. Cruise through these guys. And just make sure we're not grabbing anything on the other side there. And for these ones back here, we want to make sure that we also go in and manually offset these keys so that they're starting a little later, so that as this front side here finishes, then the back side picks up. So right about there. And then we'll do the same over here on this side. On that, and slip those as well. There we go. So it's kind of our first piece that we have done. Those all drawn. Can move on to this guy, for example. For this one, we're looking at, if we watch the shot here, you can see these guys right here just kind of slide on. So for this one, we're going to use another slice modifier. We're just going to plan it out a little differently. So essentially what we want is, we want the slice to draw out from 2 directions and then kind of wrap around the back. So you could break this apart into 4 different pieces, or what we usually tend to do is, for something that's a square like this, we'll go in and we'll rotate this 45 degrees so that we split the difference. Move this back here. And now when we slide this, it's drawing on in 2 different directions at the same time, and it'll wrap those corners for us pretty nicely. So we can get that whole motion taken care of with one modifier. So we'll turn on auto key, run that through. I'll also switch this over to face. And now it's just kind of choreographing this to match with our other motions. So maybe this happens a little bit later in time. So we'll kind of slide that back. And we'll just shift this end keyframe out a little bit so that those kind of coincide there. And then we can do the same for some of these pieces, you know, pick out a single animation for these and then go through and offset it using some of those techniques. So again, with these ones, these are set up so that their local rotations match, so that we can rotate just once. So we'll do another quick rotation for these, 180 degrees. We'll scale them all down. And we'll reverse that animation as well. And I'm just going to double check my timing here. Before I offset the keys, it's much easier to edit this animation while everything's all lined up. Once you go through and offset these keys, there isn't a good way to get everything back to square one, so usually you have to blow away the animation and re-add it, which, you know, if you're using a script like this, shouldn't take too long, but you want to kind of get everything locked down first and then go through and do any offsetting. So these ones kind of shimmer a little more. They come on fairly quickly down there, so we want this to be a fairly fast action so that we get some cool reflections going on. So something like that maybe. And then we can go through and pick out whatever order we want these to happen in. So maybe it's every other, like this for this line. And we can run that script. Let's see. And maybe I'm feeling like that's a little bit too similar, so I'm going to undo that. And maybe we'll change the multiplier a little bit here. So we'll do maybe a 2 keyframe offset for each one of these. And we'll try that. So I think that works a little better. They have a little more overlap. And then we can just take, you know, the overall keys and push them a little bit later in time. So same over on this side. We can just go in a different order this time. So maybe we'll do the whole bottom row in order and then come up to the top here. And build on those. So we'll run that and cruise through and see all our bottom ones, and then all our top ones are building immediately after. And again, we can shift all those. And then for these guys here, it was really just the exact same process, but for these ones, what I did was I did a change in position rather than rotation. So select all these and move these guys straight down, and we'll scale them down as well. For these, I want it to be a little bit faster, so I'll bring the keys a little closer, and I'll also increase my offset in position here, something like that. And then again, we just need to select these in the order that we want the motion to happen. So maybe for these ones, we'll do kind of every other down both sides. And we'll run that offset on them. You can see. So we're getting that action, and then we can just slip the whole motion to wherever we want this to start from.
Once you apply that line of script, that stays.
That stays.
Stays there.
It's not live. It's not, like if I go back and change this number, I can't just rerun it. It's already been offset. It's kind of a one-off thing. So usually what I'll do is I'll run the script, see if I like it or not, undo it, change whatever properties, run it again, just kind of tweak with that until I get something that works. The only thing you can do is if you remember what number you used, if you keep track, you can actually, if you have that selection saved, and what you can do is as you go, save the selection like mullions 1, say, right? It'll actually save the order that you did that in. So if you inverse this and run it again, it can get you back to square one. So let's see. So I think basically that covers all the techniques I had set up. But one other thing in this instance that I wanted to talk about was that for any action like this where you've got something like a floor that's repeating, I'm actually just going to kill all those. So for any kind of build like this that we go through and do, we'll do kind of one floor and get it working the way we want. And then we'll just come in and grab that whole floor and be able to offset it. So this time we'll go in view space and make that copy. We'll have to delete those guys out. We can just take all those keyframes and offset the whole thing. So maybe we want a little bit more overlap here, but the idea is you get a set of actions working that you like, and then be able to reuse that same thing over and over again. So if you had like 20 floors to this, you could easily just with snaps make 20 copies, the correct spacing, and just go through one at a time and just be offsetting keys rather than redoing any of that work. So we'll hide that one, and we'll move on to our third kind of case study here. So for this one, we're taking a look at some of these guys right here as they unfold like this. We've got kind of that cool action happening there. This can be good in a lot of different circumstances. In this case, it's for slabs, which generally are pretty boring, but it's usually a pretty important piece to build on. So if you can break them up like that into those separate pieces, it usually works out to make them a little more interesting. So here in this file, we've got kind of this simple setup. So we've got a hierarchy that we created for the slabs to unfold, and we've got a little bit more modifier work that we did for the columns here. So starting out with the slabs, I'm just going to isolate one of these. Doesn't really matter how this is modeled out. I just did it from an extrusion, but it could be something that you imported and it's already collapsed to a mesh. So generally it's kind of painful to go through and break this up into something interesting. So a lot of times for something like that, like this effect, if we know we've got, if it's okay to have a lot of squares or rectangles to it, a lot of times I'll fall back to that slice modifier and use that to break it apart. So what I'll do in this case is I'll come up with some sort of increment that I want to use, so maybe like every 20 feet. So I'll start on the end here, and offset this by 20 feet. And what I'll do is, say, remove bottom in this case, so that it's slicing off everything else. And then I'll make a quick copy of that object and flip it to remove top. And then what I can do is copy this modifier, paste it on top, jump into that one, do another offset of 20 feet, and do the same thing. So we'll switch it to bottom, make a copy, switch it to top, and that looks like it'll probably be even enough. So then I'll take all these objects at the same time, do a new slice, rotate that, offset it over here, offset that by 20. In this case, it looks like it's probably not going to be super even. We'll probably have a little bit left over. So I might just even that out some there. That. I can do remove top, do a copy, switch to bottom, just grab all these and collapse them. And then if you want to, you can go ahead and throw that cap holes modifier onto these as well. But at this point, if we look through these, we've got our pieces broken out nicely. The problem we have is they all inherited the pivot point of whatever that original object was. So if we want to do any sort of rotation on these, it's not going to work out. If we start to rotate one of these from the center, you can see it's kind of like floating out in space now. So for something like this, usually what I'll do is jump into Effect Pivot, center it on all of them, and then align them all at the same time just by moving. You can use snaps. A lot of times with something like this, I'll just eyeball it. So maybe we'll do this row is going to fold this way, and this row is going to fold the opposite. So we'll grab all those and push them to the opposite edge here. So now if we rotate these around from their pivot points, you can see they've all got correct angle to fold from now. And so what we do in a case like this is we set up a quick hierarchy so that these are linked together so that they're all kind of rotating the next piece in the chain here. So I'm going to start with this last piece here and just link all the way down the line back to this initial parent. And what I'm looking for here is when I double click on this initial parent, it should select all my pieces here. And then what I can do is, and I can do this either one at a time or across the board on all these, is just set up some quick animation, same way we did before, so I can rotate these either 90 or 180 degrees. And I can also do my scaling in the same turn on these. So when I reverse this, what we get right now is they're all unfolding at the same time. So we just need to offset these keys. So you can either do a script the same way we did for the last example, or you can just manually kind of offset these. So I'll deselect the first one, shift the keys by 10, which is half. And then deselect the next, shift the keys by 10. And so what we're getting here is kind of that folding effect happening. And this inner piece, as it starts to build on, is kind of hidden inside the next. So we'll do the same down this way. I did these separate because I didn't reverse the rotations on them. So they would have been spinning the wrong direction. So I'll do that rotation, and then scale this down as well. And reverse these. And for these ones, we want them to start halfway through the end of this one. So we'll come out here to frame 50 for our start. So that'll fold on there. And we can deselect and just shift these that same increment again. So there's kind of our final result for that. Folding slabs. And I did a pretty simple kind of breakdown of these with very few pieces just for time's sake. But the more pieces you have, the more complex your motion will look. And it's really just the same setup, especially if you're using that script. It takes almost no time to go through and do that. The longest part of that process would probably be just breaking them apart with the slices, but even that, once you get a groove going for, is fairly quick. So we jump out of here. Again, this is another element where, if you look at this shot here, it's a lot of the same motion repeating. For something like slabs that are going to be exactly the same all the way up, animate one of these and then just copy it up and offset those keyframes. And for the columns here, got kind of one final setup to look at for the exterior section. So what we've got going on here is just a simple modifier stack. And I'll turn off these one at a time so we can see. what I'm actually using for this is a volume select to be able to animate these. And the way I have it set up is it's just the default kind of setting here for the first frame, and then I just move forward in time and just animated this gizmo moving away from our initial object. And then what I did was I set it to vertex mode and just gave it a little bit of soft selection. So the effect is everything is initially selected, and then over time, in a certain direction, you slowly get that fall off until these objects are deselected as this moves away from them. And then what I did on top of that was I added an FFD modifier. So what this is doing is I just took all the points and scaled them down to 0 on this in the z-axis. So it kind of squashed everything flat. And then as that selection starts to leave these points, they move back to their initial placement. They're no longer affected by that FFD because the selection is being passed up the stack. So I can just delete these guys and rebuild that quickly. So we've got our initial model here. If you've got separate pieces, it's easier to just combine them all into one object in this case. And then on top of that, we'll throw that volume select. Some cases I like to scale it up just a little bit just to make sure it's catching all those edges perfectly. The default is like exactly matching to the maximums. So we'll push that up a little tiny bit. And we'll set our selection type to vertex. So it's grabbing all those verts. Give this some soft selection. And we'll adjust the value on that as we start to move away. And then I'll come out here in time. With auto key, just animate this moving away there. And then back here in the center, I'm just going to adjust the amount of fall off here for my soft selection so that it's a little smoother in terms of that transition. And then I just want to make sure at the end here that I've moved far enough away so everything is completely deselected. So we get that transition. And then on top of this, I'll apply an FFD. You can do FFDs, you can do X forms, you can do a ton of different types of modifiers on top of this. You can do something like noise. You can do a push modifier is one we do a lot. Any of those are fine. As long as it can inherit selection, it doesn't really matter. So I'll do this on the very first frame here so that my initial size gets created to the full object. If you do it at the end, it's just going to create on the verts that are selected. And then I'll come into my control points for this and just push these guys all the way down here. So as we drag through, they're no longer being affected by that FFD. And then one final step that I do for this is I just put a poly select modifier at the top of that stack just to get rid of that vertex selection so it doesn't display as we're playing this back. And this is a linear fashion. You could also go in and scale up that volume select and do it diagonally or something like that. You can also use within volume select. You can have this set to a texture map. So I've done animations where I did like a gradient ramp and had it start from completely black and grow out in a circular space so that the map turned white. And that'll give you kind of like the wave effect coming out from a central point. You can also use mesh objects. So if you want to model something more complex than a box, have that affect it. That's an option as well. And that object can be animated also. So that's what we've got for the exterior part. Matt's going to show some interior stuff. Were there any questions about that? This guy?
Yeah, I mean,
It's just so that we don't have the vertex selection hanging out here in the viewport. Like if you deselect, it doesn't show, but every time you select this object, it's going to show all the verts. So I just put that on top so that it just gives you the normal object display.
There's a couple of questions online here as well. It says, can you share the techniques used in Rooms Alive? Mark Michael's animation you did is amazing, it says.
I think we might be able to do that.
That's up next.
Is it? Okay, perfect.
Yep.
And there's one other one. He said he saw Nils at Artist University using the same animation, but with point cache. He wanted to know what the difference was with using point cache or not, and will it save file size or make it smoother?
So if you, I don't know, say you animated one piece of geometry that you didn't care about modifying too much, or you just wanted to kind of save it and then maybe be able to copy it around and populate a scene. Something like Vinny's just showed probably wouldn't make sense for that, but our 3D people, we certainly point cache, and any other, and I'm trying to think of other uses for it, but say you had a repeatable animation that you just wanted to populate in different scenes, you could point cache it out and just load in that file. It will make the max file size smaller, right?
Yeah.
Because it doesn't have any of the keys in there, but you are pulling an exterior file into the scene, so it's pulling more through the network or wherever you have your files stored. But I mean, it's a way to clean up the scene a little bit, getting rid of the keyframes. But besides animated people, we don't use the point cache all that much. I don't know if you have anything.
So yeah, in terms of like a mechanical animation like this, something like point cache probably doesn't make as much sense, because really what's driving this is a single transform axis. When you do a point cache, it's saving out transforms in position, so 3 different values for every single vertex in your mesh. So that quickly becomes a lot of calculations. It'll slow down your viewport very quickly. If you're running something like Alembic, it's optimized to be able to handle those types of mechanical animations a little better than the traditional max point cache. So it might be better. That might be better suited for something like this, but other than like complex organic deformations, we don't really use point cache for any of our build sequence stuff. Possibly if we were doing like some really heavy cloth simulations, we might cache it out to be able to copy it around. Something like a stadium, if you have people waving flags, we might point cache out that flag cloth animation and then be able to copy thousands of them around. But for something like this, we probably wouldn't use it.
So just a few more things to go through today. To the question online about the Rooms Alive animation. Actually had that queued up next here, so I'll just play through it for those of you who haven't seen it before. This was a client who was creating this service called Rooms Alive, where you could go online and kind of customize your, whether it's living room or bedroom, different types of rooms with different types of furniture and accessories, changing paint colors, carpets, all sorts of stuff. I think the project on their end ultimately fell through, or they stopped developing it, but we certainly created a lot of assets for them. This one film that I'll show you, but also all of the pre-baked renders, kind of all the pieces that they needed to program up on their website. But this is the kind of marketing film that we made for them, kind of showing off some of the possibilities. So I'll just play through this. So that's an example of the whole project was a build. But just kind of breaking it down and demystifying a little bit, if we look at the individual pieces in this, there's really not much that is different or complicated, but more complicated than kind of what Vinny went through. With something like this, it's the amount of pieces that are animating on and just the choreography of them. One with the camera movements, but then also with the music. So it's kind of the whole package when you're animating in a vacuum, with some of these individual pieces. It's kind of hard to see the end result after some fine tuning. Obviously we didn't have the time to go through like finessing every keyframe. And let's see if I can find an example, but some of these have a little bit of secondary motion and extra movement, like the chandelier, there's a little bounce to things and a little extra rotation and sway, and the curtains that are coming down. That was done with the bend modifier, which I can show in a little bit, but just having a little bit of extra rotation. So when you break it down, it's still, 95%, if not more, just standard position, rotation, and scale, mostly rotation and scale, but it's the choreography of the pieces that I think really sells it. It's kind of, I think our process with this would be to rough it out with some camera moves, then a refinement process of, maybe changing the camera slightly after you get a rough animation, and then once you have the camera more or less what you want, then going through and doing a second pass on the animation, whether it's rebuilding it completely or just adding extra motion and paying careful attention to the choreography. So, and if we're just looking at these pieces, the floor tiles are the same kind of flipping hierarchy that Vinny went through for the slabs. It's just each row of tiles is linked to each other, and then they're just offset. The panels in the back are, rotating and flipping up and scaling on. The floor is actually, I think, was done with a script, but more just to like a more robust script than the one that Vinny showed, but it was also just to get a little more control with something with that many pieces. You probably don't want to do it by hand every time. The examples we had showed thus far were a little smaller scale, or at least repeatable elements, but with that many individual floorboards, you probably want other scripts to help you out, but the underlying animation is still the same. It's just rotation, scale, and offsetting. Some of the more organic, like the rug, was a bend modifier, which I can show you that effect as well as how the curtains were done. But it's more about just going through the model and identifying kind of what pieces you have to work with, and just giving a little thought, like how would I break that up? How would I offset things and link things, and what order should things come on in? But at the end of the day, the techniques used are pretty much the same for all of these things. In this example, we had some pieces animating off, and then things animating on in their place, and it's just kind of that sleight of hand and offsetting the keys, just having the timing right, that sells it. And then in these last pieces were done in post, just with mattes and changing the color and texture in After Effects, just as a secondary layer. One other thing that so going back to a couple questions earlier about rendering, for this, what we did was we turned off all of the animated pieces and rendered the static room with a more traditional save the radiance map method, where you can do the pre-pass calculation, save that to a file, and then pull it from file when you render the main pass. And again, that was with all of the animated pieces off, so all the furniture and accessories. And then for the animated pieces, we just rendered them brute force and light cache. And I believe we also had the, you can see here, the camera motion blur on, V-Ray camera motion blur. Obviously, that's not ideal every time doing brute force and motion blur. You know, it's going to jack up your render times quite a bit. But for a piece like this where the actual animation was 30 seconds, 35 seconds, we felt like it was worth it to use those higher settings, take a hit in render time. I mean, I don't know, I want to say maybe 2 or 3 hours a frame on these with the brute force settings and the camera motion blur. And that was breaking it up into 2 passes. If we had the rest of the room on, brute forcing that as well would have been even higher, but since it was just the animated pieces, we're able to bring that time down a little bit. So let me jump into Max now. Let's go through a couple quick examples. I don't need to go into too much detail because, like I said, the techniques used are similar to what Vinny showed, but I have a couple examples here set up. So here's our favorite artichoke pendant lamp. Probably seen this before. I'm in the camera. So, you know, however you get this model, it may be in various states, and you need to do a little prep work up front. This one's already broken up into a few pieces, but not all the pieces we'll need. So it does have like the metal and the plastic and things like that. But like these leaves, for instance, are all one object. So we'll need to break those up before we animate it. But first, just kind of want to assess the model and figure out how you want to animate it on before you really start getting in there and start turning on auto key and rotating pieces. You know, especially for something like this where it's a little smaller scale and you have a little more control over it, and it might be, you know, more of a detail or in the foreground. You may want to plan it out a little more. A lot of time with the exterior builds, it's, you know, so much going on and such a large scale that because so much is going on, things don't need to be, you don't want to say choreographed, not as choreographed, but at maybe the scale they're at or the distance from the camera. Maybe not as much attention to the individual pieces, but something like this, if you're going to get close to it, you may want to spend a little more time on the individual pieces. So I'm just going to hide kind of the interior structure and just deal with the leaves to start. So if you look at this, it does look like there's some kind of repeated elements, some symmetry here. You know, you count them, there's 10 segments around, but they're not all identical. It's like every other one is the same. So this first one, and the third one, and the fifth one, and so on. And then the second one, and the fourth one, and the sixth one, and so on are the same. So it looks like there's 2 levels, which you can kind of confirm here. You know, there's 5 on the top level, and then, you know, another 5 on the next level, and so on. So if we were to break this up, there's really just 2 portions of it that we need to deal with and not have to deal with the whole thing at once. So make a backup before you start doing this, but I'm going to delete a bunch of pieces out of this. So I'm going to just select the one segment there and the other segment, which is opposite of it. And I'll show you in a minute why I selected those two rather than the one right next to it, but I'm just going to invert that and delete the rest out. So now we have basically our two sections that are unique, which we can then copy around and offset later. If I go into a side view here, I'm going to split this up. If you go into sub-object mode and the pieces are already elements, there's an easy way to attach all those. It has to be an edit mesh, not an edit poly, but if you switch that up and you select all the elements, you go down to explode and set the number as an angle. If you set it to 180 and hit explode by objects, we'll now save out each element as a separate object, which is useful when trying to break up pieces that are already elements. If you select a piece and it selects the whole thing, then you're going to have to do some slicing to break it up. But if they're already elements, this will help out. But as we saw before with the slice plane breaking things up, if you explode by element, the pivot is still going to be what the original object was. So I'm going to start off just by resetting the pivot to the center, and then just quickly put the pivot on the corner of the pieces, just to make the animation a little better. So I think Nils had said this a few times. I'm sure other people use similar things, but I think he said if you have to do something more than 17 times, you should script it. I think we only have 12 pieces here, so we're good to do it by hand. So once we have these pivots lined up, similar to the way we did some of the exterior build animation, I'm going to select the whole side at once, and it looked like Vinny was doing the same thing, but I also like to, be on kind of every 10 keyframes, at least to start, just to every 5 or 10 keyframes, but easier to keep track of, rather than just like scrubbing out in the middle of nowhere and setting keys. It just makes kind of, in my head, keeping track of the keyframes a little easier. And then at the end, if you want to offset things a little bit, you can, but until you really lay out the whole piece, it's kind of good to keep them at every 5 or 10 keyframes. So I turn auto key on, and as we did before, kind of animate them all at once. So I'll do 180, and then also reverse that. So those are rotating down, but I think it would also be good to scale them up a little bit. So just scale them down to 0, and then maybe have the scale finish a little sooner, and then the rest of the rotation happen. So chugging a little bit. So something like that, and then just do the same on the other side. And then once we get that done, now everything's going to be happening together, but as we did before, can quickly maybe have it happen from bottom to top. So we'll have the bottom pieces come on first, and then just offset the rest by 5 keyframes or so. So now we have our unique segments of the leaves animated, but we need to copy those around and offset them to create the rest of it. So if we remember back, there were basically 10 total segments, or kind of 5 segments that are across from each other. So if we were to copy and rotate these around, we'd need 5 total copies of this. So 360 divided by 5 is 72. So once we make a copy of it, we'll want to rotate that 72 degrees around. Before we start copying things, I'm going to create a dummy at the origin. And just put that at 0. And just link everything to it. It's going to make things a little easier to offset these. So if you double click on the dummy, it's going to select everything under it, all the children. And from there, I'm just going to clone it. And I was saying copy, but we're going to make these instances. So the underlying geometry will remain an instance, but the controller type will be a copy. So we can still offset the keys while maintaining the instance geometry. So instance that, select the dummy, rotate it 72. Select it again, clone, instance. Select the dummy, another 72, so there. One more time. Go negative this time. And finally, oops. On there. So now we have kind of instanced animation. Say you realize that these leaves didn't have, the proper detail. You're going to get closer to them. You wanted to add a little more detail. Now, since they're instance, you can still edit the geometry, and the animation will still carry through. So say you wanted to have each kind of segment come on a little differently. So you can further go in and offset the whole setup a little bit. So it'd be a little more random and not so structured. So again, there's a lot more going on here, but the underlying techniques are still the same. And you can go crazy with other modifier-based animation and animating vertices and things like that, but I don't know. A lot of the time, I feel like it's better to keep things simpler and a little easier to manage, and then kind of create more complex things with timing and choreography and offsetting things. Obviously, can't do it all the time, but for a lot of the things, techniques like this will work just fine. So going back again to the rendering side, just to move along, I won't animate the rest of the lamp. I think
Just before you move on, there's a question online, kind of in this section. It says, in animation, I found it really hard to stretch sofas. Do you use edit poly and move the vertices, or do you use another method? And also, how do you handle the texturing for it?
What was the last part of that?
How do you handle the texturing for for a sofa?
Right. So something like a sofa or a chair, something that has a lot of vertices, it can be painful to do vertex animation. And as an alternative, you would do something like we've seen so far, where you're animating the transform instead. But with that, then you can get stretched textures, and because it's applying it to the top level, and whatever UV maps you have are underneath, and it's going to stretch things out. So it's hard to say. It depends how close you get to things. You can use things like scale, or the slice plane, sorry, that will kind of preserve any kind of geometry or UVs underneath. You could do some other squash and stretch animation. It kind of depends on what you want to do. I mean, if you're animating a sofa or a piece of furniture, you know, like some of the ones in here, then some of your traditional transform animation would be fine, but it depends. Like if you really want to make it realistic, you might even get into some cloth simulation and some more detailed things like that. So
a lot of times we try to make the transitions fast enough so that it kind of covers up some of those UV issues, because when the object's in motion, you're going to have motion blur applied to that at some point, hopefully. So that should, especially for the detail in something like a sofa, unless you're really close, a lot of that detail is going to go away as it's motion blurred, and then you're only going to see the end result as it comes to rest.
So I have just a simple setup here. It's just a watered down version of that video with just, you know, two chairs that animate. One animates off, one on, and then those lamps animate on at the end. And it has a camera move. So just how to break this up to render it. Again, with anything, a lot of techniques on how to render animated objects. You know, throughout the years, V-Ray has added in other irradiance map settings to make things easier. You know, they've had the animation pre-pass and animation rendering in for a while now. We've never gotten great results with it. We'll still try to split things up into multiple passes and then composite them back together. So I'll show a couple techniques for that, what we do here. So going back to one of the lessons earlier, if we select the room and go to the V-Ray properties and do the matte object, -1 alpha, shadows, and effect alpha. When we render this out, I'm going to leave it on in Radiance Map and Light Cache for now, but I'm going to change that in a minute. So first thing you notice in the alpha, it's cutting out all the other geometry, keeping our 3 main pieces. It's also catching the shadows and the reflection of the chair. You'll notice it does throw a lot of, it looks like splotchy noise in the background. I guess technically that's the GI contribution that the objects in the scene are casting on the room, even though the room is matted out. Since we had the shadow catching on, it's going to catch whatever GI bounces on there too. We don't really worry too much about that, because if you go in and sample that, you'll notice the alpha is at 0.005, which is pretty low, and with a quick levels or curves in post, you can crunch that out pretty quickly and not affect the rest of the scene or the edges or things like that. You know, as soon as you crunch the alpha down a little bit, you'll lose some of the shadow quality, but like comparatively, the shadow alpha is at 0.6, whereas the rest of the scene is at 0.02. So you bring the levels down on this to clean up this noise, and then it will still leave the shadow. So, you know, one way around that is to, and I think in this scene in particular, the reason it's doing it is because of the V-Ray sky. If we shut that off, it'll clean that up, but you're not going to get the sky contribution, which in some cases may or may not be important. You may not need to have that on. In our case, we do want it for the color, but if I turn that back on, you'll notice that the background, even though it's cut out of the alpha, you still get the blue and white. And when you save that down with an alpha, it's going to cause issues with the edges and fringing when you bring it into After Effects or another compositing application. So a way around that, you can do a couple things. You could put it in just a V-Ray dome light. On a hidden layer here. So the V-Ray dome light, and you can drag and drop the V-Ray sky map into that, and then turn it off of your environment. And you want it invisible. And at 1, multiplier of 1. So you still get the GI quality of the V-Ray light on the objects, but it is not in the beauty pass. So the objects will be kind of pre-matted on the black instead of the white, which will we need to turn our priority down again, our V-Ray priority. Yep. When you do dump it into the dome light, it's now inheriting your sampling and resolution from the light, which you'll notice gives you more noise, but by increasing the sampling, you can get rid of that. But this would be a better way to render it than on the right, just for the edge issues. And you'll notice it does pick up things like reflections on the floor, but actually we should probably have it not affect reflections. Now we won't get the light from the windows on the ground. So that's one way to do it, but when you just want that overall environment contribution, don't always need the actual V-Ray light, so you can also dump it in the environment overrides here. And you can put it in, and this you have control if you want it just to be the GI or the reflection refraction as well. It'll still be invisible, so your beauty pass will still be black, but you'll still get the contribution on the various pieces. So this is kind of the basic setup that we would do for animated pieces. But as you know, if you do a radiance map, and especially at single frame, you'll get a lot of flickering. So for something like this, we'll typically use brute force. Do, 16 to start. You may need to go up higher, 24. And then if you have your light cache up high enough, if it's too low, the light cache will still flicker. But if you have that up high enough, you can get pretty good results that pass for animated objects with this type of setup. So you'll soon notice the render hit once it gets to the main pass, but it's a lot better than having to render the whole scene as brute force, where you can just do the animated pieces. You will notice that there is more noise on it, which you would need to increase those subdivisions to get rid of that, but sometimes that's okay. Adds a little realism to pieces, but you can also clean that up in post a little bit as well if you want. So that would be our typical render pipeline for the passes, is the one pass of the static scene, even with a moving camera, the traditional save to radiance way, and then matting out the rest of the scene, still catching shadows and reflections, and then doing a brute force light cache setup, and then compositing back together. One final way I'll show you real quick is, I don't know if anyone has used the V-Ray sphere fade. It uses the atmospheric sphere gizmo that's native to Max, but it allows you to isolate certain parts of the scene. So I'm going to set the room properties back to normal, so it's not matted out. And I'll show you why in a second. I'll create a new sphere, so it's in the helpers atmospheric apparatus sphere gizmo. And basic idea is you put it on a non-hidden layer. And drag it around so it kind of encapsulates the piece that you want to render. And you want a little buffer on the edge because it will fade out to feather that edge. You can turn the feathering down, but then it'll be a harsh edge and make compositing a little trickier. So you want to give yourself a little room to work with. And then in the environment tab here, you add the V-Ray sphere fade effect. And from there, you can pick and link up the different sphere gizmos you created. And then this is where you can change the fall off if you want it to be softer or harsher. And it's as simple as making sure atmospherics is checked in the common tab. And I'm just going to switch it back to a radiance map just for rendering, so it's a little quicker. But you would still use the brute force method for this because they're still animated. It's just a different way to limit the scene on what it renders. You would also still have to render the room out with the save to radiance method and composite this on top, but it's just a different way of doing it than if you were to use the matte properties for the rest of the scene. So if you render this out, you'll see.
There's a couple questions online here. It says, do you use the same technique in moving cars and people?
Yes. The two techniques that we just went through, depending on kind of how much integration it needs to happen with the backplate, mainly how close or far they are from the camera, and if they're kind of going in and out of shadow or traveling in front of or behind glass, you may want to use the sphere method to get better integration with the reflections and shadows when it's aerial shots or just sunlight, exterior lighting. You can do the first method with the matte properties just to get the main pass and the shadows out and composite it on top of. It's a less accurate solution, but it's quicker and easier to set up. So if you go in the this alpha here, you can see how it feathers it out. We may have actually made our sphere a little too small because you can see it's starting to eat away at the chair a little. So you can either make the sphere gizmo bigger or change the fall-off amount down to have it feather it less. But yes, both techniques we use, and it's not one or the other, or in any particular case, it's one or the other, but we kind of assess the task at hand or the project at hand and decide what's the best method.
And oftentimes we'll even kind of combine the two in the sense that we'll use that first matte property setup. But if you recall, there was a lot of that scattered GI throughout the room. So sometimes you have a scene where that's happening, not necessarily because you have a skylight, because you have a lot of interior lights or something like that. So we use that matte property setup, but then we'll also use the sphere fade gizmo on top of that to limit some of that additional GI and noise that's happening. So we just have a quick script that'll run through, and for every single animated person in our scene, create a sphere and link it to their center or something like that. And that just limits that extra noise. And that actually, we found it saved about 77% of the render time, just in terms of it. V-Ray will completely drop that extra stuff from the scene as it goes through that rendering, rather than calculate these, 100th of a decimal point alpha channels out there.
So these techniques also, just you did notice that we're using beta version of V-Ray 3 at the moment. All these techniques we have developed in the past out of necessity, and there's a new feature in V-Ray 3 where you can actually render selected objects, and it would render the object with all its properties matted out. So haven't really gone too deep into it, how can you render the shadows or not, or the reflections. But the long story short is that it's going to be easier because you're going to be able to select objects, all the people and all the cars, brute force them, and then maybe only render them with the surfaces that they have in direct contact with, and then put that on top of your main pass that was saved with an irradiance. So it's going to be better, but it still would have to be combined with one of these two techniques in the future once we all get our hands on V-Ray 3.
And that's been an issue kind of since people started rendering animated objects. It's always been animated objects with global illumination. It's the flickering and how to work around that. And obviously rendering times are getting better, and the techniques available or the tools available are getting better, but there's still not a perfect solution. It's kind of using what you have and assessing, how the shot is set up and what's the best method. So, it's good to have a few different methods in your arsenal and be able to apply the best one. So hopefully experimenting a little more with the latest V-Ray. Some of these new techniques may be better and replace some of the old ones. So, we're getting there, but it's always been an issue.
There's another question online as well. It says, do you use brute force in primary or secondary? And if you use primary, should you use light cache as a fly-through mode?
So typically, we'll do brute force in the primary, light cache in the secondary. And I like to keep the light cache at single frame, especially for animated objects. You do the fly-through, it's going to kind of blend it throughout the whole camera path. But with animated objects, the objects are moving, so the light cache calculations have changed frame by frame. So the fly-through may blend it down enough and not have it flicker and be okay. But if you do keep it on single frame, you can crank the subdivisions up high enough, 1600, 2000, even higher, to get around that, because the higher this number goes, kind of the less error there will be, so the more consistent it is frame to frame, and you won't get that flickering. The irradiance map is a different story. You'd have to crank the numbers up quite high in that to get no flickering, and then the times are going to be unusable. But with the light cache, you can go decently high, remove a lot of that flickering, and still have it render relatively quick. I mean, the light cache calculation isn't a huge time suck, especially if you have a scene that's limited with only the objects that you're rendering. I mean, you wouldn't want to crank it up too high if you had the whole scene going, but with certain pieces, it should be fine.
And do you increase or decrease the sample size of the light cache?
Increase or decrease?
Yes. Or you put only 0.02 always?
We definitely experiment with that. I mean, it's, as with a lot of things we've gone over, I mean, the defaults are kind of out of place because it makes the most sense for kind of the most common uses. But so a lot of times we'll leave it as is, but we certainly do have to change that depending on how big the scene scale is and how much precision you want. I mean, try to just affect one parameter at a time, and because once you start changing multiple things, it's hard to track down kind of where the effect is coming from. But yeah, I mean, all the parameters are kind of up for grabs in terms of changing them. But there's certainly a hierarchy that will start with certain ones and then if need be, go to the others. So just one,
What techniques do you use to animate trees or leaves, branches of trees?
So to be honest, we don't do a whole lot of vegetation animation. The ones we do are pretty self-contained that, we'll just do it by hand if it's a plant that's growing out of the ground and, with some of the techniques we talked about, but other modifier-based animations. For trees, I mean, that's always an issue because when they're so static, it makes it look more fake, right? There are some plugins we've used in the past. The Onyx Tree Storm does have a wind control in that, but if you used it before, it's not the most stable plugin. It can crash a lot, but the results are good if you can get it right and just not fiddle with it anymore. So we've definitely used that, the Onyx Tree Storm, for like palm trees blowing in the wind. You can also use like a noise modifier on the leaves if they're far enough back and you just want the subtle movement, but in the foreground it's going to fall apart. So we'll use other techniques if, we'll even composite an actual video or shot tree in the foreground if we need to. Put something like coming in off frame. We might not do that in 3D. We'll use some practical shots. Different techniques, and it's kind of assessing the shot and seeing what makes most sense.
Hi, have you ever used animated proxies for those trees?
I haven't used a whole lot of animated proxies. I guess going back to the tree storm one, if you had a solution that you liked, you could bake it down to an animated proxy, and it would just save out the underlying vertex animation, and you could have those kind of in a library that you could kind of reference. They've never been kind of that pressing of an issue to kind of build that library out, but you could certainly have a bunch of different tree animations and then save those as proxies. I mean, we've used animated proxies before, not a lot, and not for trees, but I'm sure the methodology would be the same and it would work fine. Have you tried that method?
Yes, but the file became a little unstable, and that was like, a year and a half ago, so we never tried it back. That's why I was wondering if you were using it. Because, I mean, that solves part of the problem. It's like a mesh, but with a tree, and in a proxy.
Right. Because it has a separate file for each frame, and the tree is probably pretty big on its own, so.
We've learned through the years that keeping it simple is better for that particular reason. There's all these features that all these programs, and as good as many programs are, they all crash, right? And the more you push them, the more chances it's gonna crash. So to Matt's point, it's have we done all those things? Yes. Have we tried every single feature of all these programs? Yes. Have we learned not to use them? Yes. It's like there's no need, right? It's like I said the other day, you better have a damn good reason to do it. If we do have an animated tree, it's either a real tree in the foreground, right? Because it needs to be a real tree. Or we better have, a damn good looking 3D tree that is actually animated, and that part of the story is that the wind is blowing and it's moving, right? If not, then just have it be static and save yourself a headache. We did an animation. I don't know if you can find that animation at the Monash University one, where the trees move a little bit, but you get the wind action with leaves falling. So you render the leaves falling off the trees, as a separate pass, very straightforward. Put them in the animation, and that's it. You're done. So it's it's way easier than trying to have animated proxies and stuff like that. There you go. Wind. And that's just, you can tell it starts to fall apart. If you look at that branch, go back, Matt. Look at the branch on the top left. Yeah, and it's moving, and we might have overdone it because it's just the bend modifier, right? But you're really looking at the leaves falling, and that sells the idea. So it's being creative in how to use these things and how you tell the story is more important than what plugin to use.
The final thing I just want to touch on quickly here, won't spend too much time on it, but just a quick explanation on the comping the two passes together. I mean, it may seem straightforward, but I just wanted to show you have obviously your beauty pass and then an animated pass. In this case, it was an animated people in car pass. And with the techniques we've done earlier, you're catching the shadows and also the reflections of the people in the glass storefront. You notice, I guess, at the beginning, you see those lighter gray is the reflection in the glass there. So you can just slap it on top and it will work because everything was matted out. But if you set up some multi-matte elements, you can separate the different channels. And in After Effects, you would do that with the set matte effect. And you can pull the different channels. So pull the red. It's just the red. And you can use the track matte on the people in car pass using an alpha matte mode. And now you have just the people, no cars, and also no shadows and reflections, just the people. So you can color correct them separately. You could duplicate that and then use matte from green channel instead. Now you have the cars. Duplicate that a third time and not use a track matte and put that under it. And then this would be your shadow control. So if I change the opacity, you can see that it's the shadow and reflection control. So just that simple setup, you can get the 3 layers out just with one render pass, or one time rendering it, because you get the multi-matte element for free. So you think, oh, I need the people and the cars and the shadows. Do you do it in one pass or multiple passes? You can set it up all in one pass and then break it back up in After Effects and have separate control over the different pieces. So, this was just 2, but you could set up, 10 multi-matte elements and have every person as a separate one. Or in the case of this animation, you could put each piece of furniture on a different mat and then have separate control over it from its shadows and the rest of the scene. I know the guys tomorrow will go in a little more detail in the compositing side of things, but just wanted to kind of close the loop on the animated elements and compositing them back together.
So another question online here. It says, what's the average render time per frame for animations that you try not to exceed? He said he heard that you guys try to keep it under 15 minutes. Also, he wanted some specific stats on the render farm.
So I'll say, if we can get frames at 15 minutes, that's great. Not always possible, so half an hour is probably our average and an acceptable level. Sometimes they start creeping up closer to an hour, which will allow, within reason, but once they start going much more than an hour, it may be time to start figuring out why it's taking so long. And a lot of times you can track that down. It may take a while, but it's some material or some piece of geometry or some light that you've brought in from 10 different projects, and you didn't create everything from scratch, so you don't know all the settings, and could be causing the render time to go from a half hour to 3 hours. But once you're kind of in the zone and making the scene, you're not checking every little piece until you set it off. So, it's kind of, I'd say that time is more first 720p. If you go from 720 to full HD, it's about 4 times, right? Yeah, or doubling the pixels, total pixels, I think.
Let's say when you render and there's no the client doesn't really require to have the video on full HD. What is your standard, 720p, or if it is not required to have the video on full HD, do you render it still in full HD just in case later on they need to have it like that, or?
It depends. We usually render everything at 720, right? 1280 by 720. That historically, since HD was adopted, that's what we have been doing for obvious reasons. It's takes less time to render. If a client asks for a full HD film, we do a full HD film. If a film like the one I showed you yesterday at the end of the day has a lot of footage that it's obviously 4K and 1080, then we do the whole thing at 1080, or we up-res some of the CG, because there's no reason to go down. We started rendering a lot of things in 1080, but it really is on a case by case, right? Like, is it really worth it? Are you going to be using it? How are you going to be presenting this? It really is a matter of, is it worth it? Just recently, someone asked us if we could do an animation in 4K, and we asked them like, well, do you have a 4K TV or something to play 4K on? No, then why you want it at 4K, right? So first of all, it's gonna take, I don't know, 10 times more to do, and the files are gonna be insanely big. So it's gonna move there, but it's gonna be on a case by case, I think.
What's the setting for the anti-aliasing to avoid flickering?
So you're saying like very small objects or thin lines that may blink in and out frame to frame?
Yeah.
I mean, we get that with trees in the background, or like, parking lot lines, like the white lines. So 2 ways around it. You could render it bigger, the render size bigger, or the anti-aliasing. I mean, we typically do the adaptive, min-max method. Obviously defaults to 1.4 if you used it. If you go up to 3.6, 4.8, it's going to take a lot longer to render, but it will most times take out a lot of that flickering. But you could also render the plate bigger or render the particular elements bigger. So there's no sense in rendering the whole thing twice the size if it's only the trees that are flickering. So you do the matte properties on the rest of the scene, so it's just rendering the trees, and render those at 1920 instead of 1280, or even bigger if need be, and then in post scale them back down, and it will do a better job of not having that flickering, and kind of smooth it out.
There's also, again, I go back to being creative. If you think of trees, it's easier to just grab the tree and have a forest pack and fill the whole thing with trees, and that's the end of it, right? But then you're using the wrong tree for the wrong shot. You're using a very detailed tree to render in the distance, and that's gonna be bad, right? In theory, and this not always works, but in theory, you should think about doing a matte painting, like render do the 3D trees the way you would do them, render a pass of those trees high res, like Matt is saying, and then use that as your backplate. And then you map it onto simple geometry, and then you have an alpha. So that pre-multiplies the edges, right, to the whatever you have behind it or in front of it. So other things we've done is, for example, for smaller objects, and one of the films that we showed you yesterday, the Colombo Tower that has all that stepped balconies, all of those had trellises. They had these shading devices on the balconies, and we had that problem because they were geometry and they were so small. So we just made a plane with a map on them, and so the map does the right trick. So instead of is the shot looking down, Matt? That one.
That one?
So if you play that part, you would see there's.
Oh, these trellises?
Yeah, those guys is basically just a map. It's a plane with a map. It used to be geometry, and it really bothered one of the owners of Neoscape, so I had to change it. What was that?
If you remove reflections, like from the leaves of the trees, that's something that
Yeah, there's no reason. That's another huge mistake, right? You have these fancy trees a kilometer away or a mile away, and then you have subsurface scattering and all sorts of dumb things. And obviously, it's just gonna take forever to render. It's gonna have all these artifacts. So again, it's just. Unfortunately, not always you can plan for these things, or sometimes you know that things are going to have to change. But ideally, if you have your animatic and your storyboard, approved by your client, then you can plan for these things, and you can dissect your shot properly, and then you don't have to worry about this kind of stuff. Matt and I in particular have worked in a lot of, like, all the Hilton animations we've done. It's a bunch of interiors that have a lot of shiny materials, right? The one thing is that for a still image, it's so easy to just crank up the settings and render it, and it's gonna look super sweet, right? But if you really think about the actual properties of a material, like the tables you have in front of you, and I apologize for the people online, but anything that glossy, it's the result of a certain amount of reflectivity and the bump that the surface has, right? So if we make the mistake in CG of just cranking up the reflection and then glossy 0.3, 0.5, and then you have to crank up the subdivisions, and that's just too noisy. The real trick is to add the right amount of reflectivity to the material and the right bump, so that in between the two of them, it creates the right reflection. So what we have done very frequently here at Neoscape is, for an animation, you tone down the reflection a lot, almost to the minimum you can. Then you fake the highlights with the V-Ray material, and then you apply a very good map for your bump, and the combination of those two is going to, and you tone your glossies to like 0.9, right, or like 0.85. So a combination of not having too much glossies, having a nice bump, and a small reflection would decrease your render time by a lot, and it would get more or less the same effect. It's not gonna be the same effect. Yeah, decreases subdivision by a lot, by like I said, 0.85, 0.9, something like that. And you can especially with floors and like tables and wood materials and stuff like that is helpful. It's just again, you have to go back to reality to have a grounding point and go from there. You can always tweak it however you want to tweak it, but I think that's the easy way to troubleshoot these kind of crazy render times.
And there is a different philosophy when rendering still versus animation. And a lot of times we'll do stills for a project first and then do an animation, but there is quite a bit of kind of prepping the scene for the animation, because we would have cranked a lot of the settings for the still, but you do need to dumb those down, or else your render times will be quite high. And since you're not rendering the animation at a high as res as the stills are, then you don't really need the settings to be as high. It's not as worth it in the end. And I mentioned it earlier, but that noise plugin, the Neat Video, we've used that as well. More so when we're compositing the passes up from scratch and you're able to isolate the different elements, but applying just that noise plugin to the reflection pass only to clean up some of that noise. So, if you say, oh, I do want the glossy reflections the way they are in the material and not having to tweak the settings too much, render it noisy, knowing that you can clean it up in post. Still need to know how to do that, but knowing that it's available to you and not feel like you're tied to whatever comes out of Max. There's some cleanup you can do later on.
Right, so I guess we'll wrap it up for today. And just a reminder that tomorrow we will be doing the post in the morning, and then we'll follow by the normal schedule. So tomorrow, probably going to be wrapping up around 5 or 6.